Yeah. Okay, everybody. So welcome all of you to the Radical Anthropology Group. This evening, it's great. We have Fabio. Fabio, actually, he is an astrophysicist. He began his career working out very difficult questions like, will the universe expand forever? And what is this strange thing called dark energy? And then he met the Radical Anthropology Group and came across the work in particular of Lionel Sims, who of course is one of the founders of the Radical Anthropology Group. And suddenly decided that he could carry on with his astronomy, but this time astronomy as seen from planet Earth, horizon astronomy. And he has progressed enormously, very, very rapidly, quite an astonishing lot of work he's been doing. And in particular, he's the co-founder and co-editor of the journal of Skyscape Archaeology, which kind of, for those of you who know about our work in radical anthropology, we've always said that ever since our species emerged, we were kind of astronomers in the sense of organizing our lives as hunter-gatherers, aware of what the moon was doing, and of course the seasons and other changes. So in a sense, our theory of human origins has always been that astronomy wasn't suddenly invented, it was part of what humans have always been doing. And a way of expressing that very, very simply is to say, on Earth as it is in heaven, the fundamental principle really of all the world's religions. So there's something perfect about the sky. Mostly things on Earth aren't all that perfect, especially where humans are concerned, but there's always been an ideal that the two things, sky and Earth, should kind of match up. So that's in a kind of nutshell. Fabio is lecturer in, he's in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology in the University of Bournemouth, and he lectures in archaeological modelling. And he's now moving on a bit from some of his previous work, and in particular is going to be talking, of course, as we've advertised, about Irish and British Neolithic monuments, and in particular in connection with what some of us as social anthropologists have always been interested in, which is ritual in general, and in particular initiation ritual. So looking forward very much. And we've actually got a record, I think it's true to say, we have a record participation. We have 55, and as far as I can work out, that's a record for this term. So congratulations. Fabio, can't wait to hear what you've got to say to us all.
No pressure then. So let me just share the opening slide. Can you see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Excellent.
Is it as big as it can be? Have you done it on full screen sort of thing? On my screen, it's, oh, I see, that's fine. No, that's fine, because it's, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you, Chris, for that very generous introduction, I have to say. Not that it's not true, it is true. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be back here and seeing so many names. A lot of,
oh, something's gone wrong.
I'm going to talk about passage mounds. Sorry?
I'm just going to,
oh.
Yes, your sound isn't very good. I'm not sure why. Perhaps we should mute. Could everybody mute who doesn't, I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, is this any better? Can you hear me? I don't know. No one is saying anything. I'm just going to proceed. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about passage mounds specifically focused in Britain and Ireland, which is a bit outside of my comfort zone, really, because as those of you who have seen my previous talks at RAG will know, I've focused mostly on passage graves in Portugal and Spain. But I'm kind of shifting into a more local view or take on the megalithic structures that we have here in these islands. And before I move on from the opening slide, and because I see his name in the room, I have to say that this this lecture is heavily illustrated by photographs by Ken Williams, who is a fantastic and famous photographer of megalithic monuments in Ireland. And I'm going to use a lot of his photographs here. Also, for those of you who know me, I usually don't read my presentations, but because this is actually a paper that is being readied for publication, I will be reading it out. So if it's boring, I apologize in advance, but I'm trying to illustrate it with fantastic imagery to keep you awake and entertained throughout. So passage graves are a monumental architectural form that first appears in the Neolithic period. The earliest examples appear in Brittany around 4300 BC, where there have been a tradition of non-megalithic passage graves that may have been at the origin of this architectural form. In the UK and Ireland, they probably first appeared around 400 to about 3700 BC, although some of these early dates are still somewhat contested. They typically consist of one or more orthostatic chambers, meaning chambers made of standing stones, with a narrow access passage. This megalithic skeleton is then covered in earth or stone so as to enclose the chamber and passage within an artificial mound. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. Variations on this theme appear throughout the Atlantic facade, making them one of the most recognizable prehistoric architectural forms. Some of the most famous examples include in Ireland, the passage tombs of Newgrange and Knowth, and in Britain, the chambered cairn of Maeshowe in Orkney, the burial chamber Bar Cloddia de Gaures in Anglesey, forgive me for my mispronunciation of the Welsh, and Bryn Ceffrly Thu, both in Anglesey. The intentions behind the sudden appearance and the vast geographical distribution of this type of structure are one of the most hotly debated topics in prehistoric archaeology. That they were the site of ritual actions and possible worship is widely acknowledged, but the motivation behind their construction, the meaning of its architectural elements, and the dynamics of use remain largely inaccessible. What I want to do with this talk is provide a critical review of some of these themes, while at the same time drawing attention to and connecting threads that have hitherto been largely explored in isolation. The potential role played by ritual sodalities in the creation and use of prehistoric monuments, as suggested by recent ethnographic surveys, is presented as a possible unifying framework to push forward academic thinking surrounding these iconic structures. So let's start with the terminology that we use to talk about these archaeological sites. Concepts and their associated terminology can be liberating as much as they can be a straitjacket. New concepts establish new cognitive links and relations in the mind of the thinker, which can open up new ways of thinking, whereas on the other hand, old concepts carry baggage with them. When this is unconscious, it can constrain and limit the thinking around a particular topic in ways that one is often not even aware of. It is therefore healthy to, every once in a while, attend reflexively to the concepts we use and be prepared experimentally to reconstitute them, as Albrad and Peterson suggest. In the British Isles, there are many designations for what are but the different expressions of the same architectural form. The examples given above already featured three of the most common: chambered cairn, burial chamber, and passage tomb. This problem is compounded when the rest of Europe is taken into account, with the French allées couverts, the Spanish dolmens, and the Portuguese antas, among other national and even regional terminologies. But for the moment, I'm constraining myself to the British Isles. The first of these terms describes the structures as cairns, which is not entirely wrong, considering that this is what they often look like when seen from the outside. It is, however, not fully appropriate, since some of them have mounds not made of stone, but of earth, clay, turf, or more commonly a combination of all of the above. However, though cairn is not always appropriate, one can always refer to them as mounds, irrespective of their composition. These mounds are often qualified as having chambers. However, there are many other megalithic structures, such as cists, tholoi, tumuli, and barrows, that are essentially mounds with chambers that can be either open or closed. These structures are fundamentally different, not only between themselves, but also different from those I'm focusing on. It is apparent that the unique architectural characteristic that unites these prehistoric monuments is not so much their cairnness, nor their chamberedness, for other monuments also include those architectural elements, but the passages that connect the interior chambers to the exterior world. Passage grave, therefore, seems more appropriate, as it puts emphasis on the important architectural feature. What is unfortunate about it is that the second word, grave or tomb, as is most common in the Irish archaeological tradition, is a loaded term that has been constricting our interpretations and conceptual explorations of these structures, or at least that's my argument. For a moment, let's imagine a post-apocalyptic scenario, where 4 millennia from now, archaeologists will not have access to any writings prior to 2020. When I wrote these words, it was before lockdown, so actually this was quite prophetic, I have to say, but anyway. So let's imagine these archaeologists 4 millennia from now, with no access to writing. Upon encountering the last remaining ruins of an early medieval church, one of only a few they have seen, they mount a large excavation project to uncover its secrets. Upon digging, and after removing a considerable number of stones and little else, they reach the floor level, and underneath it, they identify a number of human burials. With little else to go on, they interpret this mysterious structure as a collective grave. And this is the opening salvo for a range of interpretive speculations that may or may not have any bearing on reality. We do know that up to relatively recent times, churches were sought out places to bury the dead. This function of medieval churches is, however, secondary to its primary purpose, which was to provide an appropriate architectural setting for a sacred and theatrical liturgy, and a glimpse of what heaven might be like. It is this purpose that provides the other functions that a church affords, including burials. Therefore, when it comes to churches, the path that starts the interpretative process with the notion of a grave or tomb is a tortuous, if not an erroneous path. Moreover, it would almost certainly prevent one from reaching one's destination, which in this analogy would amount to understanding medieval churches as ceremonial and representational spaces first and foremost. The lesson to take from this exercise, and the question that must be reflexively asked, is whether the same doesn't apply to passage graves. Human remains have been found inside the chambers of a number of passage graves, but they are missing from many others. And in some, there is evidence to suggest that their deposition was episodic. At Quantanes in Orkney, which is perhaps the best example of large-scale depositions of human bones, only the side chambers were used for the placement of human remains, whereas the open space in the main chamber presented only evidence of fires being burned there. In other sites, only small quantities of human bone were ever found. Now, I'm not the first to suggest that burial was not the main function of passage graves, but the moniker passage grave has unfortunately remained in use. I would argue that the passage is the most obvious architectural element of these structures, at once differentiating and unifying. Differentiating because it differentiates these monuments from others, such as long barrows, cairns, tholoi, artificial mounds, and the like. And unifying because it is a common feature of so many structures along the Atlantic facade. Regardless of the presence or absence of other elements such as differentiated chambers, lintels, engraved or painted art, depositions or furniture, the existence of an artificial mound enclosing a space that is accessible via a passage is the common theme to all of these structures. To avoid the traps of the presently used terms, I would suggest we refer to them as passage mounds. But as Latour said, there is no good word anyway, only sensible usage. So even more important than a mere rebranding is to let go of the constraints imposed by the previous terminology and then allow new and experimental yet sensible interpretations to flourish. And that's what we're going to attempt to do. So when it comes to the symbolism or the meaning associated with passage mounds, their suggested association with death has already been mentioned. In both the general public and at least some archaeologists' minds, passage mounds were primarily tombs. From that interpretative basis, which, as we've just discussed, may very well be erroneous, it is then too easy to speculate on other non-burial related architectural features. The round mounds thus became symbols for the life-giving breasts of a mother goddess. The passage and inner depths of the chamber became a womb. The art depicting her eyes, face, or sex, and the dead placed inside were therefore returning to the source of life. Such words or variants have been too often uncritically repeated in publications for the last century. But archaeology has moved on from these antiquarian speculations and can now rely on greater and newer sources of data to base interpretations on. Like most other prehistoric monuments in Britain and elsewhere, megalithic art is often associated with passage mounds. The Irish examples of Newgrange, Knowth, and Fornox are perhaps the most famous, with Barclodia de Gaures in Anglesey in Wales being a close fourth. Elsewhere in Europe, the same association exists. Some scholars have sought in megalithic art the meaning and purpose of the monuments where they feature, much like an art historian might focus on the art present at a given church. Using Irish passage tomb art as an example, it has been variously interpreted as representing a goddess, solar deities, and entoptic imagery generated during altered states of consciousness. Robert Hensey did a critical review of past studies and highlighted the fact that there may not be a singular meaning to all of the art, which is often the result of several centuries of use of the sites and therefore the result of changing perspectives. O'Sullivan identified 4 stages of artistic creation in the Boyne Valley, which permits for much more nuanced readings. For example, whereas the depictive art of his stage 1, stage 2 art uses these as motifs that are part of more sophisticated compositions, like here. This indicates that the passage tomb, sorry, I need to change slide. This indicates that the passage tomb carvers in the Boyne Valley were usually employing a culturally sanctioned range of motifs rather than making direct recordings of their subjective visual experience. The idea of a culturally sanctioned framework comprised of individual elements is a point taken up and expanded by an unprecedented analysis of the spatial structure of passage mounds. Guillaume Robin has shown that there is a remarkable similarity in the architecture of passage mounds across the UK and Ireland, despite regional and local differences. He identified a basic architectural model, symbolic and abstract in nature, that spatially organizes the whole monument, and which is expressed in 3 key ways. Firstly, as concentric spaces that form and enclose the monument. You can see the many spheres here on the left. Secondly, as thresholds that are evident in the passage and chambers. You can see the thresholds marked here by the dotted lines, and we'll see some examples of what is there in a second. And as axial oppositions in the fabric and content of the structures, meaning that what happens on the left side of the main axis is different from what happens on the right side. So regarding the first of these 3 ways that Robin identified, he notes that there was an intention in making several concentric spaces or rings around the megalithic chamber by using distinct layers of materials, such as earth, stone, or turf, both on the surface of the mound and internally. Furthermore, The intersections between these layers often have additional structures such as ditches or stone rows that serve no functional purpose and therefore may have acted to enhance these boundaries. You can see an example here of a ditch and the stone setting with an inner stone circle. This is Bryn Cathlidu in Anglesey. The same thing occurs in the space that immediately surrounds the mound, where curbs, ditches, or stone circles can add further enclosures. So basically creating more and more of these concentric circles around something. Inside, in the megalithic passage and chamber, the thresholds between the concentric layers are emphasized by sillstones, lintels, or jampstones, which often feature carved or painted art with specific motifs that Robin called threshold signs. Here are the examples from 4 Knox. The most famous examples of these threshold signs are these parallel chevrons or zigzag motifs that you see here. These are found in 4 Knox, Nouth East actually, and Barclodia de Gaures, among many others, not just in Britain and Ireland, but across the Atlantic facade actually. Curiously, these same symbols appear also in the terminal spaces of the chamber. So they're not just here in these intersections of those concentric spaces, but also at the end of certain chambers, including the backstone itself, possibly, as Robin interpreted, to signal entrances and thresholds that cannot, however, be physically crossed, and that may therefore be symbolic doorways. Finally, Robin identified the virtual axis of the structure as forming a line of opposition upon which the 2 sides of the monument can provide contrasting materials, deposits, carved motifs, or furniture such as basins. There equally seems to be an overarching architectural emphasis on the right side. And you can see here how the main axis of Newgrange is represented on curbstone 52, which is this stone here, by this line that clearly separates very different motifs on the left and on the right. And you can see the same thing happening on these other structures as well, Loughtreuel and Le Petit Montferry, which is in Brittany. So coming back to the overarching model, overall, this model is not an interpretation of the monuments per se, but rather it argues that there was a singular architectural model with an associated belief system that was shared by the Neolithic societies of the British Isles and possibly beyond. Robin ties this model with elaborate funerary beliefs and rituals that would have been performed at these sites. He therefore still is hanging up or hanging to the grave notion of for these sites. In particular, he follows Christopher Tilley in arguing that the threshold signs on the backstones were doorways to the beyond, only to be used by the spirits of the dead. And he further suggests that the basin stones often found in front of these threshold signs could have acted as offering tables to the dead. That's certainly one possibility. Now, 2 other archaeologists, Vicky Cummings and Colin Richards, expanded on this idea of concentric enclosures, but attribute a very different meaning to it. They suggest that we need to move away from the idea that the presence of passages enabled continual access and the deposition of human remains over prolonged periods of time. Instead, they propose that these passage mounds acted as technologies of wrapping. What does this mean? They suggest that the concentric rings and layers that we've discussed, in combination with the depositional strategies, what they were depositing inside these monuments, as well as the placement of art sometimes in hidden locations, is evidence of an interest in the practice of wrapping, whose purpose is to conceal, protect, and or unify that which lies within. They found no commonalities in what was being wrapped. What is it about the space inside the passage grave that they want to conceal, protect, or unify, that is, to wrap around that space. They couldn't find a pattern. So they have argued that it may have been that it was the act of wrapping that was important rather than the contents themselves. This led them to suggest foregoing the importance of the passage altogether and instead focus on the contained space and that which wraps it. However, I would suggest that maybe throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as the passage not only enhances the wrapping layers by featuring those threshold signs that we were talking about, but actually the passage's axis is marked in engravings and emphasized by the axial oppositions Robin found. So there's clearly something about the passage. We shouldn't just ignore it. For me, the crucial question that Cummings and Richards should be asking is, other than axis, which for them is secondary, what other purpose could the passages serve? Now this leads us to the sky, or the skyscape, I should say. Passage mounds are often associated with skyscapes and celestial alignments. Perhaps the second most famous alignment in the world, after Stonehenge, of course, is that of the sunrise on winter solstice at Newgrange. Now, Newgrange was built in such a way that its passage points towards the rising position of the sun on the days around midwinter. On those dates, the light of the rising sun enters through the famous roof box that stands above Newgrange's entrance and penetrates the mound and its long passage, hitting the central chamber and creating a phenomenal light show that attracts over 30,000 hopefuls to its winter solstice lottery draw. But Newgrange is not alone, with a few other famous examples of solar alignment in Ireland and beyond. The southwestern passage at Douth has an alignment to winter solstice sunset. Loch Crew Kentee is also a famous alignment to sunrise at the equinoxes, whereas Knockroe's two passages align with the rising and setting sun on winter solstice. In Great Britain, Maes Howe is the most famous passage mound alignment, also with sunset at winter solstice, although there's some interesting discussions going on at the moment whether or not this is due to a more recent reconstruction of the end of the passage. So watch this space for further news on that. However, Maes Howe, although being the most famous, is not the only one, because Bryn Cathli Thu, on the other hand, aligns with the sunrise on summer solstice. And that's one that I have verified myself. However, I think that one could be leaping to conclusions if one were to assume that this was an intrinsic feature of all passage mounds. If we look at Ireland, whose passage tomb orientation has been studied quite in depth by a colleague of mine, Frank Prendergast, who furnished these slides actually, it is quite clear that although solar alignments do appear, particularly on these tombs marked by the red dots, they are not ubiquitous. They don't appear everywhere. They are present in only 18.2% of the total number of mounds with extant passages. Now, this alone shows that solar alignments cannot be a part of a unified explanation for all passage mounds in the UK and Ireland. Indeed, solar alignments may be merely a specialized and highly localized enhancement of Robin's model, adding a temporal component to an otherwise spatially focused prototype. It's also possible that direct sunlight was the missing ingredient that activated Robin's symbolic doorways. Or perhaps it's the revolving action of the sun around the Earth that was seen as yet another layer of enclosure and wrapping. Either way, these processes could only activate or come alive for a short time throughout the year when the sun was aligned with the passages. And I think that's a very important point to bear in mind when thinking about these things. Alternatively, it's possible that by focusing on the sun, we may have been missing the point. There are other celestial objects that may have been more important in prehistory. To stop one's search with the sun betrays an anachronistic and ethnocentric bias in favor of bright objects, the sun being the only celestial object that modern city dwellers really notice, while neglecting the far more interesting nighttime skies that prehistoric people would have access to. And of course, many of you here will know about the importance of the moon, but what I want to highlight is actually the stars. It's a curious, though downright missed fact that those structures mentioned before were also aligned to some of the brightest stars in the night sky. Around 3000 BC, any structure featuring an alignment to the winter solstice sun would equally align to Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. It is equally possible that passage mounds for which no significant solar alignment has been found may feature alignment to other bright stars, as well as the moon, I should say. But the point I'm trying to make is because the stars have been ignored, and there are these correlations between the position of the sun on the solstices and particularly bright stars like Sirius at particular moments in time, which actually coincide with when these structures were being built and used, we may have to think slightly differently, start thinking about the possibility that they may have been intentionally aligned to these stars rather than the sun. That's certainly the case in Western Iberia, whose prehistoric landscapes were also dotted with passage mounds, and as I've mentioned, I have studied in relative depth. Previous studies, before I came at least, measured the orientation of several hundreds of these monuments in Iberia, Portugal and Spain, and did not manage to identify any significant patterns in orientation. They concluded that they must have been aligned to sunrise or sun climb on the day that construction began, which, since the sunrise position changes every day of the year, it's just another way of saying that their orientations were quite varied. There was no pattern. However, those studies came with two prejudices. Firstly, that the sun would be the most important celestial object for these Neolithic cultures. And secondly, that the passage mounds are actually, accurately orientated within 2 to 3 degrees. With regards to this aspect, when I started doing fieldwork at these sites, it quickly became obvious that this could not possibly be the case. These mounds are much smaller than their Irish counterparts. Their passages are much shorter, the placing of the stones looser and the stones themselves rougher, as you could see in the photos in this slide, as well as the plan here. There's no straight lines on most of these structures. With more than 100 sites surveyed by my team in Portugal and Galicia, it became apparent that the average uncertainty in orientation exhibited by the architecture of these passage mounds is of about 20 degrees. Now, this may seem like too much to be able to identify any alignments to sun, moon, or stars, but it turns out that estimating these uncertainties is exactly what is needed in order to identify patterns, whereas before no patterns were visible or apparent. One only needs to look at the overlaps in the uncertainty ranges. So when I did that for a particular cluster of monuments, I found that there were regions of the sky that were common to all the fields of view of all of these structures. So if you were to sit down inside all of these structures, you would see roughly the same patch of the horizon and therefore the same patch of the sky. Now this here is a reconstruction of the landscape, basically the horizon line from the different structures. And the bit that is grayed out is the bits that you would not be able to see if you were sitting inside of them. And the bit in blue is the overlap, is the pattern, is the bit that you would be able to see from every single one of them. So if there was any celestial object that was being targeted by all of these structures, it would have to be an object that rises inside this blue band. And I just went looking for it. And what I found was that when I looked at the most likely celestial targets inside that blue band, I found that some of the brightest stars in the sky kept popping up, especially Aldebaran, the orange-red eye of the Greek constellation of Taurus, the bull of heaven, if you want. Now, this star would have been seen for the first time in the year rising in alignment with the passage of these prehistoric monuments towards the end of April or beginning of May, so around May 1st, really. Therefore, marking the best time for these communities, which we know were transhumant pastoralists, to follow the star onto the high pastures of the mountain range above which the star rises. So the star will be seen to rise above this mountain range around the May 1st, which actually until very, very recent times, until the 60s, was the actual date in Portugal where the shepherds would take their sheep and goats up into high ground, not as far as this mountain range, I have to admit, but maybe in prehistory that is what they were doing. It's certainly not without precedent in historical times, mostly in the medieval period. And he may therefore be older than that. And we do know from the archaeology that it actually is in that mountain range that these communities would have spent their summers with their sheep and their goat. So the methodology I employed for this study therefore allowed us to identify a celestial target that seemed significant for those communities where no alignments were previously believed to exist. And as Chris mentioned, I think before he introduced me, before the recording started, I then found out that this narrative that was completely based on the archaeological record matches pretty well with the folklore of the region, particularly the folklore that explains the name of this mountain range, which is still known as Mountain Range of the Star. And I now believe Aldebaran to be the star that the mountain range is referring to. Now, a stellar alignment would not create any spectacular light effect, certainly not like the fantastic photos I've been showing you. And therefore, it's unlikely to be an explanation for sites like New Grange. But for other passage mounds with a more direct line of sight, the observation of a culturally important star at a particular moment in time may have been quite significant. Together with my colleague Daniel Brown from Nottingham Trent University, we have speculated that for someone sitting inside the chamber of these monuments, looking out through the passage, the architecture of the passage might have permitted the star to be seen days before any communal observation outside. We've managed to demonstrate this using lab work. And it's a curious fact that we are playing with the limits of naked eye vision. And by adding this tunnel-like effect of the passage, together with the color contrast between the dark blue early morning sky and the orange-red star, these effects conspire to enhance visibility of that star, and suggests that indeed these passages allowed for the observation of the morning rising of stars days, if not weeks, before they become bright enough to be visible by others standing outside of the mounds. However, we do need more research to ground truth the lab work through experimental archaeology, and we were actually planning on going there this spring. We have managed to get a very generous sponsor to build us a tent that is the exact same shape as this passage mound, I should say, that you're seeing here. And it's completely covered in black, so it's completely blacked out. And we're going to position it next to this monument, pointing at that horizon. But because the skies have shifted over the last 6,000 years, we're going to be pointing it slightly north so we catch the same star, Aldebaran. And we plan to basically sleep there for at least a week, getting ourselves up every morning to try to see if we can spot that star before some of our colleagues who are going to be staying outside. It's going to be a fun experiment. Don't think it's ever been done in archaeoastronomy, but alas, now there's basically no travel or fieldwork. So let's hope that next year we can do that. So a stellar interpretation for British and Irish passage mounds, so now returning to these islands, speculative though it may be at this stage, could equally fit Robin's model, with the rising or setting star marking the right moment in time to cross the thresholds and perform whatever ceremonies were performed in the inner recesses of the passage mounds. The circular motion of the star through the heavens would act as a further wrapping layer, And judging by our lab work, the material technology of the passage mound would not only act to spatially conceal those that were within it, but also temporarily conceal them by ensuring that any ceremonies occurred only when those within could see the star. So we're slowly but steadily getting somewhere. Now, it's already been suggested by a number of archaeologists, far more famous than myself, that the prehistoric monumental constructions of the British Isles create a symbolic separation between the space that is outside and the space that is inside. Now, although this may be true at a symbolic level for most monuments, as indeed it is for most structures, domestic or monumental, you just need to have some walls to have a symbolic separation between the outside and the inside, I would argue that passage mounds are unique amongst the prehistoric monuments, in that this separation is not only imagined, but can actually be experienced and felt with the senses. The otherworldliness of the interior space of a passage mound may be a fleeting and subjective sensation in the present day, but when one considers the environment of the prehistoric people that built and used them, then one must acknowledge its somatic objectivity. What do I mean by this? What I mean is that when one enters the inner world of a passage mound, as they would have stood back then, one is confronted with a darkness that would not be available anywhere else 6 millennia ago, when no place in nature was absolutely dark. Without light pollution, the darkest night becomes a canvas of light and color provided by a myriad stars, the Milky Way, as well as the moon. Well, even overcast nights aren't as dark as the inside of a passage mound, since the clouds scatter and diffuse the light of the moon. This is, of course, assuming there is a moon. We can come back to this point in the discussion, perhaps. This night sky type of darkness would have been the default experience of the dark in prehistory. By contrast, the passage mound creates a space that is at best umbral and at worst pitch black. During daytime, the passage is the only way light enters into the chamber, often reflecting off of other surfaces, except on specific days of the year when in the presence of a solar alignment. But in twilight and at night, the inside of a passage would be immersed in total darkness. But it's not just sight that is changed when you enter a passage mound. Hearing, one of the most important senses, and now actually one that has been suggested to be more important than sight in pre-literate societies. It too is noticeably different when you enter a passage mound. The sounds of nature, which are undeniably present in the outside world even at nighttime, would be missing or muffled inside the chamber, whereas sounds produced within would be enhanced in unnatural ways. Tests performed at these sites show that the mound has a dampening effect, distorting sound that passes through the passage in either direction. So the architecture of these passage mounds makes it possible to largely shut out the sounds and sights of the natural world, creating a silent and dark space, against which it is possible to construct entirely new worlds of sound, which could not have been recreated anywhere else in the surrounding landscape. With this in mind, it has been suggested that Neolithic structures act not so much to enclose space, but to enshrine sound. And I do think sound is a key aspect that has been missing from all of this, and that deserves further study. Finally, smell and touch could also be stimulated by the different textures and odors, such as the rough stones forming the walls of the chamber, the smell of damp, the lack of oxygen when you have enough people breathe in a confined space, and maybe even the smell and smoke of whatever might have been burned over a fire, such as the fire at Quantinus that I mentioned before. Now, these sensory experiences would be so unnatural, so different from mundane existence, that they may very well have been conceived as otherworldly. Perhaps more so than that of the hinge or the stone circle, the inner space of the passage mound provided phenomenally and somatically tangible experiences of another world. The many enclosures, layers, and thresholds that we've been talking about that wrap the passage mound might have been understood as necessary to contain or even control this other world, in addition to providing access only to those who were ritually prepared to journey between these worlds. In fairness, there are other places in what we call nature that feature similar characteristics to the ones just described. And I'm talking, of course, of caves. Caves have been used for several millennia before the first passage mounds appear, but it is likely that the inner space of the cave was equally considered to be otherworldly, or at the very least, its entrance was often seen as the entrance to the underworld, as attested in many, many cultures. Therefore, the inner spaces of caves and passage mounds might have both been conceived as other worlds, one having a natural gateway, the cave, and the other having a constructed one, the passage mound. From this perspective, a passage mound may perhaps be seen as an expression of the domestication, taming, or control of access to this other world. And we must bear in mind that they only appear in the Neolithic after the appearance of farming and domesticates. So the idea of taming the land, not just as the physical land or the animals, but taming nature, taming the world, taming the other worlds, might also have been a heavy part of their belief system, or rather of the transformations, the so-called counter-revolution that occurred in the Neolithic. Now, the missing, or the last ingredient in this soup. So what brings all of these elements that I've been discussing together? What could be behind the construction of the passage mounds? One option is that they were the places where the line that separates the world of the living and the world of the dead was thinner, if we go back to that notion of them being merely graves. Another option, also discussed, is the one expressed by Cummings and Richards, that the wrapping was meant to contain and control dangerous animating practices, possibly involving freestanding monoliths that are found in some of these passage tombs, but not all. A third possibility, sometimes voiced by archaeologists, is that they were places for shamans to cross the worlds, usually involving alternate states of consciousness and entoptic imagery. Now, these three interpretations, or combinations or variations of them, together with the prevailing view of passage mounds as tombs, are invariably found in the archaeological literature on the topic. That's basically what you find everywhere. There is, however, a fourth possibility that has not been voiced often enough, and that I believe has the potential to bring all these hypotheses into a single framework. And that is that passage mounds were built by prehistoric secret societies. Not talking about Freemasons, but perhaps their prehistoric ancestors. Now, secret societies are attested in the ethnographic records of trans-egalitarian or complex hunter-gatherers, as well as agricultural, tribal, or chiefdom societies. They are non-kinship organizations that are based around the performance of rituals and are therefore referred to as ritual sodalities. They include members from different kinship groups and even different communities, thus establishing a level of organization, control, and power with a far wider demographic and economic base than otherwise might have existed. Brian Hayden, a Canadian ethnoarchaeologist, has conducted a large-scale ethnographic survey on secret societies, and he's argued that they are the missing link in the current understanding of power consolidation and ritual organization within traditional societies, and in how you go from simpler, perhaps egalitarian societies to more complex societies. The spiritual claims to power that these secret societies hold are legitimized through the appropriation of many of the pre-existing iconographic and ideological elements of their own cultures, in order to make their claims more accepted, or so Hayden suggests. They certainly have an aggrandizing nature, And by this nature, they materialize the most elaborate traditions of their cultures in terms of ritual, art, music, food, dance, costumes, and language. As he surveyed the ethnographic record for these ritual sodalities worldwide, Hayden identified a number of archaeological markers that may help us identify them in prehistory. And these include the following: the construction and use of special structures for rituals within or near communities, remote locations where ritual training of initiates, storage of ritual paraphernalia, and or more exclusive rituals were performed. Ritual paraphernalia which was carefully curated and or destroyed at the end of its use life. Elaborate and sophisticated art in ritual locations. Power animal iconography, usually not representing major animal staple food species. The induction of altered states of consciousness in ritual context, often including art associated with vision quests, and the use of dark, claustrophobic locations, hallucinogens, masks, and mind-altering sound effects. And lastly, special mortuary treatment of high-ranking members, which were often buried in either the main structure of the society, under cairns or tumuli, or in special remote locations. Now, I have to say, there's a lot of variability in the ethnographic record. So Hayden is not suggesting that we need to find all of these elements in order to identify that a secret society would have existed in prehistory. Instead, what he suggests is that a more polythetic approach, where the more of these elements are found in the archaeological record, the more probable it is that they represent a secret society. Now, in the old world, Hayden has applied his approach to the the European Upper Paleolithic caves, as well as the Neolithic of the Near East. I would like to extend this discussion to the Neolithic and Bronze Ages of Western Europe, which has, as far as I know, not been done by anyone. So as you can probably gather from the preceding discussion, individual passage mounds feature some, if not most, of these markers that Hayden identified. Collectively, actually, all these markers are present in association with passage mounds in Britain, Ireland, and elsewhere in Europe. The case for secret societies, which is built neither on first principles nor on individual ethnographic analogues, but on this large survey of traditional societies worldwide, provides a robust interpretative framework to start to think, or rather rethink, passage mounds and even other prehistoric monuments. When it comes to passage mounds, this framework can account for their architectural features, since the creation or use of dark, enclosed, and secluded spaces is a key component of the ritual structures of at least some secret societies. The wrapping of layers around this inner space could have been conceived not only to separate the worlds or contain and control access to the other world within, but also as a metaphor for the hierarchical structure of the secret society, with levels of access being negotiated through thresholds by initiates of various degrees. Prestige goods made of exotic material and often found at these sites, and sometimes ritually destroyed or fragmented, which is the keyword that archaeologists tend to use, could be understood as ritual paraphernalia that were used in the celebrations that occurred inside or outside the structures. The otherworldly inner space of the passage mounds could have been used to induce ecstatic experiences, which could be the reason behind the acoustic properties of these spaces, as well as the ectopic imagery that is present and seems to later be appropriated as motifs. The existence of several passage mounds within close proximity or as part of clusters can also be understood from within this framework, since according to Hayden, there were frequently 2 or 3 or more secret society organizations using small ritual buildings within communities, which makes sense primarily in more exclusive, competitive contexts. According to the ethnographic record, the secret that these secret societies possessed was not that they existed or who belonged to them, because that was well known, but rather the ritual knowledge that members claimed was the key to their supposed arcane supernatural powers. This arcane knowledge often encompassed sophisticated solar, lunar, and other celestial observations and knowledge. This based on the survey that Hayden has done, which is yet another element that can not only be investigated archaeologically, as we've discussed, but actually seems to play a role in the axial orientation of the passage mounds. Now, to close the circle and return to the topic of human burials, which we started off with, it's worth noting that high-ranking members of such societies were sometimes given special burials in close proximity to secret society facilities or in remote locations, rather than with their own kin or community. So it would therefore not be unusual to sometimes, but not always, find human depositions inside these passage mounds, if they were being constructed and used by these secret societies. And finally, as the ritual sodalities seem to be all about demonstrating their power and control over the supernatural, or so Hayden claims, it would be fitting to think of passage graves as wrapping technologies or otherworld gateways that can be tamed and controlled only by the members of the secret society. So to conclude, passage mounds are one of the most iconic European prehistoric structures, but our understanding of them has been hampered by the indiscriminating repetition of the funerary interpretation. Alternative ways of thinking are needed, and some of the most exciting research avenues found throughout the archaeological literature have been pulled together here. The architectural design of passage mounds created an inner space that is completely separated from the outside, both symbolically and phenomenally. The sounds, smells, and lights of nature were not only absent, but were replaced by a somatic experience that could only be characterized in a pre-modern world as preternatural. This otherworldliness was emphasized by design elements such as rock art found in so many of these monuments, the number and diversity of wrapping layers, and in at least some cases, the depositions and other offerings placed within. The passage itself was not only a gateway for the initiated to journey between these worlds, but at least in some cases, and only in very specific days in the year, they may have also acted as a conduit for the sun or starlight to activate, animate, or stimulate whatever or whoever was within. These elements, the architectural, the artistic, the depositional, and the interpretative or symbolic, find a natural home in the ethnographic analogue of a ritual sodality, a secret society of individuals not related by kinship, who are nevertheless brought together by a shared ritual language, and if Hayden's interpretation is to be believed, by a common thirst for power. Similar groups in prehistory may very well have been behind the construction and the use of these highly ritualized monumental spaces, and they may provide the missing ingredient that fills up the spaces between the traditional social versus individual, symbolic versus functional, and magical religious versus political dichotomies that are still so prevalent in archaeological thinking. Thank you very much.
Well, that was absolutely fantastic. Absolutely. What an experience we've all been through with you. Oh, goodness. Wow. So I'm trying to think of something to say. Okay. You tantalizingly mentioned the counter-revolution, and of course okay. I mean, for me, the constant theme all the way through, especially with that rather amazing slide of total darkness and somebody going through a door, brilliant slide you had on for about 5 minutes. To me, that was this let there be darkness. And as you said at the beginning, we too often assume that everyone is interested in the sun, the light, and all that stuff. And of course, I'm just so much aware all the time, really, when I'm thinking about this and during your talk, of my absolutely astonishing experience among the Hadza, where Camilla invited me. I think it was the year 2003 or 4, and we were involved. I was absolutely so honoured to be invited by the Hadza to witness air pime. Air pime being their once a month dark moon ritual. And the experience of being in the dark, and there was a very big point was made, every single element of light, any artificial light, any cigarette, any lamp had to be turned off. I mean, because the experience involved communication with not exactly the ancestral spirits. That's not quite how the Hadza see it, but there's a kind of rather amorphous feeling that somewhere, maybe in the stars, but we certainly saw the stars astonishing. I mean, I've never experienced the Milky Way like we did then, but any kind of light pollution will interfere with the communication between us here on this world and these spirit beings. And so let there be darkness is the fundamental rule. But of course, when you were mentioning towards the end of the talk, these Neolithic secret societies with their thirst for power. Of course, the hunter-gatherers are egalitarian, the immediate return hunter-gatherers are egalitarian, and this power is very much, I mean, the women are present, there's a huge amount, as you were saying, again, all you can do during epime is hear things because you can't really see. You might see the outline of epime, of the spirit being, but essentially you're just hearing this extraordinary polyphonic singing all through the night. So I suppose I've got a kind of question. Could you just say a little bit more about the relationship as you see it between this version of Let There Be Darkness, that as I understand, all wisdom comes from the dark. That's the inner world, the other world. If there's too much light around, you're just going to be stuck in this world. What's the relationship between these versions of Let There Be Darkness and the much more widespread ancient egalitarian hunter-gatherer versions of Let There Be Darkness? And I just want to say one more thing. You mentioned the moon earlier on. Of course, the crucial thing is that if you're interested in any of the stars, any of the constellations, it has to be dark moon, because of course, as soon as you've got a moon, I think you sort of mentioned that, as soon as you've got a moon, somehow it's going to be much harder to see those stars. So any interest in the stars, or in a particular star, or different stars, means that your ritual is going to be performed at dark moon, which is exactly what we think in Iraq, gatherers were always doing. There's something about the dark moon which invites danger. In Africa, it would be danger from lions who've got brilliant night vision, of course. You sing together, sing for your lives to keep the lions away. How would you just describe the overall relationship between these versions of Let There Be Darkness and the earlier hunter-gatherer versions?
So first of all, let me preface what I'm going to say next by saying that this is pretty much fresh ink on the page, and I'm still thinking about these things, and actually I look forward to the discussion because you guys are much more knowledgeable about the ethnography than I ever will be. But the way I see it is similarly to Hayden, but not exactly the same. I see the secret societies as being a missing link between egalitarianism and more complex hierarchical societies, in the sense that, specifically focusing now on the prehistoric monuments, what they are trying to do is tame that darkness. They're trying to take control of that darkness that perhaps previously, in the Let There Be Darkness that you were mentioning, that is more general amongst egalitarian hunter-gatherers, is not controlled by any one individual or group of individuals. And so these structures, and I starting to also think the caves in the Upper Paleolithic were already kind of indications of this shift into a more controlled social access to that space and to that magical space. That's what it is, isn't it? The supernatural, whatever we want to call it, or whatever they called it. which then materializes in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age as actually we are constructing the gateways.
Yeah.
If you want access, you need to go through us.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that very much epitomizes the counter revolution.
Mm.
Except that perhaps it's not as fast as was previously believed. You know, farming arrives and then suddenly everything changes. Maybe this change has been occurring over millennia. Maybe it started towards the end of the Upper Paleolithic when the climate changed.
Mm.
And it then takes, it basically picks up pace in the Neolithic and Bronze Age when suddenly the very idea of controlling and taming the animal world and the plant world kicks in. Because suddenly, you know, I keep having this image of imagining a hunter-gatherer living in a pristine landscape, and then suddenly seeing a Neolithic shepherd walking in with sheep following him, or cattle.
Mm.
It must have been wild. It must have been like the Native Americans seeing Columbus arrive, or Cortez rather. You know, it must have been completely alien to them. But suddenly these concepts appear and they start to mold them, and it starts to change them, and they start to be tainted by them, which is what we do, we, the West. And I'm extending the West further back in time. Because of course, back then it was the East, because agriculture came from the East, but anyway. But yeah, that's basically the overarching framework of where I see these things falling into.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got quite a lot of people's hands up. Abiola Fisher.
Yeah, hi Chris. Hi Fabio. Thank you very much. Fascinating talk. Question is, I'm not sure I've understood this, so which is why I'm asking. Are you saying that these mounds, as burial mounds, you're actually overturning that hypothesis that these could not have been burial mounds? These are actually secret society mounds, or so hold on, start my video. Oh, sorry. These are like secret society mounds, or are you implying that they were multi-purpose spaces? Because I'm not sure, because these are burial mounds which we've come to accept, and I'm not sure whether you're trying to dispute that and saying, oh no, you have to think about them completely differently, or in addition to burial mounds, they're also secret society spaces. Sorry, that's my question.
So that's a very good question, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify that point. Two things I want to highlight. The first thing I want to highlight is I'm not talking about the structures that are commonly referred to as burial mounds, like the barrows that you find around Stonehenge, because those are mounds that don't have a passage. And they certainly have, as far as the ones that have been excavated, they have burials inside, and then they are completely covered by mounds of stone and earth and turf. But there's no access to the inside space once they were constructed. I'm talking specifically about the ones that are called passage graves, passage mounds, long barrows, chambered tombs. Okay, there's lots of names for them. But those are the ones that have a passage. You can access the inside. And actually, when you look at how many of them are there, not just in Britain and Ireland, but throughout Europe, you will be astonished at how few of them have bones in them. Now, there's many reasons why they may have had bones and we can't find them anymore. You know, most of these sites were pillaged or throughout the past 5,000 or 6,000 years, or otherwise destroyed. In some cases, particularly for instance in Portugal, where I spent a lot of my time investigating, the soil can be acidic. And if the soil is acidic, then the bone doesn't survive over millennia. So there are explanations that the archaeologists have been hanging on to while still continuing to think about these sites as graves. But what I'm actually suggesting is that is constraining our thinking, and therefore we need to think differently. We need to think about the primary function of these sites. What was it they were built for in the first instance, even though they may also have been used as graves. And that's why I gave the example of the medieval churches, because medieval churches were also used for burials, but that was not their primary function. So we need to think also about what we mean by the function or the meaning of a site, because usually there's multiple functions to any structure we think of. You know, even in modernity, our houses are not just a place where we sleep or where we eat. You know, we store things in them, etc. Our ritual spaces, again, we can go back to the churches, are not just used for ritual, they're used for a variety of things. Prayer, for burials, not anymore, but they used to be. So what we need to go back to is the primary function of these structures. What is the real purpose for building them? The key symbolic meaning that then allows them to be used for secondary functions, like the burial. It's the fact that the church is a microcosm of heaven that attracted the nobility and the kings of old to be buried in there, because it was a more direct access to heaven. It was not the fact that it was a grave, right? And that's what I think we need to start thinking about prehistoric structures in this way, because such a narrow, we've been so narrowly focused on graves. We keep repeating graves, burials, funerary, ritual, etc. There's so many other possibilities that need to be explored.
Okay, that's okay. Alan Kozlow.
Yeah, hi. I had a very interesting astronomy professor when I was at University of Buffalo in the 70s, and he wrote two books, one that came out in 1975 on megalithic software of the British Isles, and then one in 1982 that was on megalithic software of Europe and Middle East. And what he did was he looked at structures that span civilizations and that were added to by later civilizations. And he then looked at the axis of the structures, and he then looked at what stars were rising at the various times, because sometimes you look at a structure and the axis changes as later civilizations or later generations add to it. And he noticed that the axis changed, and then he looked to see if he could find specific stars that at that time, at that period, rose, because the stars, as you know, move across the horizon. And he was able to actually document which stars were used for which structures that span pre-Roman, Roman, and Christian eras, that things were added to the structures. And I just wanted to make sure the books are called Megalithic Software and published in 1975 and 1982 by Lyle Borst, B-O-R-S-T.
Okay. I'm making a note of that.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with it, but that type of approach is very characteristic of that decade, actually. It's very typical of what was happening in archaeoastronomy all over the world. So thank you for that. I will investigate that.
Camilla.
Hi, thanks for a great talk, Fabio. I'm going to ask about your thinking on the axis of gender. I don't know the book by Brian Hayden recently, but I know some of his earlier cross-cultural work around ritual. Very largely, Hayden focuses on, as you say, the trans-egalitarian hunters, so-called complex hunter-gatherers, though actually egalitarianism is hugely complex. But anyway, we won't get into that argument. But these Neolithic groups are predominantly, at least incipiently, pastoralist, yes?
In the British Isles, yes.
In the British Isles. So have we got, or is Hayden providing, some ethnographic precedent for pastoralist secret society of such a nature, as against, say, initiation age set or whatever? Anyway, can you expand on that? then a second question, if you want to, is where you want to go with this to sort of explore and expand the hypothesis. And I was going to throw in, which you may not want to talk about, is the famous recent stuff of Wengrow and Graeber that's going to be coming up, which is trying to argue that Neolithic societies are lovely, fluffy and matriarchal. Maybe that's a simplification, but you seem to be definitely following the route that things get pretty dark in terms of power struggle, things, and between, I mean, I'm assuming you mean partly between the genders. That's the direction of it. Anyway, go with that.
Okay, lots to unpack there.
Yeah, go with what you
so
want.
Your question from, first of all, let me preface this by saying, I like Brian Hayden's thinking. I don't necessarily like his conclusions. And that actually goes back to his previous work on ritual. Can't remember the name of the book, but the one about the shamans. But I find this book is most useful as a source of the ethnographic data, for me at least. Now, you ask a very good question about the pastoralist examples. I actually can't remember reading a single example from a pastoralist community. Just a very good point to make. But I will investigate that. But as a counterpoint, I think we may be slightly overemphasizing. No, I'm not happy with either. We need to bear in mind that they weren't, strictly speaking, pastoralists.
Okay.
Because these sites, the earliest megalithic sites, appear with the beginning of the Neolithic, which involves the introduction of all sorts of domesticates. Now, we're not talking full-scale farming, we're talking about intensive horticulturalism type farming, rather than extensive. That only comes in the Bronze Age. But what happens is that within a few hundred years of Neolithic being introduced to the British Isles, the farming collapses. And that's when they resort to pastoralism. And that's when the massive structures like Stonehenge and Avery pop up. So the big complex ones, and I honestly cannot imagine dragging those stones without a lot of cattle to help move them, right? Yes, when we're talking about those structures, like the sort of stuff Lionel does, yes, I think we can possibly think of them as pastoralists. But these passage graves are slightly predate Stonehenge and the henges, basically, and the stone circles. And we're talking about that point of transition when farming, according to the evidence we have, starts to collapse.
Okay.
And now the question is, clearly there's, well, in the British Isles, I'm not saying this happens all over Europe, because that study hasn't been done, but clearly there's a connection between the two, because suddenly megalithic monuments appear everywhere and farming is on the downturn.
Okay.
So what's going on? Are they trying to take control of the limited amount of resources? Are they trying to take supernatural control of the land, try to reinforce fertility, to bring it back? According to the latest,
it's crisis architecture. It's
crisis architecture. That's a very good way of putting it. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. That helps explain a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Then your second question, I mean, it ties in with this, the question about the matriarchy. It ties in with this. There's a crisis. Something needs to change, and people usually take, opportunistic people take charge and take control. And then yeah.
It's not a situation of abundance.
It's not a situation of abundance. No, exactly. That's another thing that we keep thinking. Oh, you need to have huge agricultural surplus to build something like Stonehenge. Well, they didn't. We now know they didn't. They were living completely off wild fruit and berries and things like that, and pastoralism. That's all they had.
So Fabio, because a lot of us won't know this, I mean, I didn't actually know that farming had sort of got underway with these islands and then collapsed So before I take Dor Shilton, because he's in the chat, I think he's got a couple of questions. Could you just say a little bit more about what kind of farming you're talking about that did collapse?
So this is relatively recent data, 2012, I think, the first paper that looks at this. When farming arrives in the British Isles, we're talking about what archaeologists call intensive farming. We're talking about horticulturalism. We're talking about intensively extracting vegetables and fruit from a small piece of land. We're not talking about extensive farming that comes in 1500 years later with the Bronze Age and the plow, where you can plow huge fields and then sow them and etc. We're talking about small groups doing a bit of gardening and extracting enough to sustain themselves. That's
more
what
like Papua New Guinea until very recently,
yes, exactly like that.
Yeah.
That's actually an example that is commonly used, and this is actually true all over Europe, not just in the UK, but we're focusing on the UK and Ireland. Now, that was well known. What is new is the fact that 200, 300 years after it's introduced, it basically, the amount of domesticated plants that is found on archaeological sites after the introduction of farming starts increasing and then starts to decrease again within 200, 300 years.
Goodness.
And the number of wild foods actually is constant throughout the entire period. A separate study, actually, completely independent, suggests, and it's pretty well established by now, actually, that actually there's a population crash. There's a bust, a demographic bust. There's a boom with the introduction of farming, and then the population crashes. Now, there's still a bit of debate around that, to be honest, because the data can be interpreted in a multitude of ways. But the farming signal is very, very clear. And then for about 1,000 years, until the Middle Bronze Age, they rely entirely on pastoralism and wild foodstuffs. And it's in the Middle Bronze Age, with the introduction of the plow, that extensive farming kicks off. So we have different type of farming coming in, taking over the fields, and then this allows for much larger populations, and everything takes off.
Why don't you call the earlier, what you call farming, horticulture?
Yeah, that's to be honest, that's
as opposed to what I think of as farming is you're actually producing food to feed the cattle as opposed to letting them just graze, which is plough agriculture, for example.
Yeah.
So,
to be honest, that's what I tend to call it, horticulturalism. But my fellow archaeologists don't like it. They still call it farming, intensive and extensive. But
okay.
When I say that, people don't understand. We keep talking about farming, and people have this image of farming in their head, and that's not what they were doing for 1,000 years. That no one was doing that.
They need to know. They need a little bit of social anthropology, evidently. Yeah, quite.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, we got Dor Shilton. You put something in the chat. Do you want to ask those questions directly to Fabio? 2 questions. Are you there? Maybe Dor needs to be unmuted. Maybe I need to unmute everybody. Ask all to unmute, because otherwise he's probably unable to talk. Dor, are you there?
Sorry, I just put it in the chat there.
Yeah, there you are, Dor. Well done.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
You can't see you.
Okay, so just no, I'll just read that if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah.
So it's just talking about the function of an isolated space which separate. Oh, sorry. Well, it's just there in the chat. The function of an isolated spiritual space seems to be dissociable from that of observing sky events. So I'm wondering if Fabio thinks that these are separate hypotheses. And I was just wondering how many people fit into the inner chamber of these average, on average, on these passage mounds, and does he envision a crowd surrounding these types of rituals? Thanks, Fabio. It was fascinating.
Thank you very much, Dor. Those are very good questions. If you don't mind, I'll answer the second one first, because I suppose it's easier. The sizes of these structures vary greatly, and with the sizes, also the number of people you can fit in on an average in a chamber. But from experience around basically the entire Atlantic facade, I would suggest that it goes from 2 people, maybe 1 if you want to have something else inside with you, to, for example, thinking of Newgrange, one of the largest examples we know, no more than 10, maybe 12. So we unlike the stone circles and the hinges and these other structures that appear slightly later, we are talking about structures that demand a very small number of people to be inside. So by their very architecture, they are already exclusive. They're already dictating exclusive access. But as you say, and many archaeologists have suggested this before, that there would be a crowd outside, either surrounding the monument or just on the outside, because some monuments, not so much here actually, but more in Iberia, they tend to have a sort of forecourt in the front, slightly to the side of the passage actually, where some ritual objects have been found, some figurines and some curiously shaped stones that archaeologists interpret as of having a ritual purpose, because that means we don't know what they were used for. So yes, that is a possibility. That is a distinct possibility that there was something happening outside as well by a larger, a slightly larger community. But again, it could tie in with whatever was happening inside. If we want to think of the inside of these structures being used for initiation rituals of, teenagers or young kids really becoming adults or being initiated into the secret society, depends on which interpretation you want to take, then there is a role for someone being outside, for instance, singing or playing musical instruments, whose sounds through the passage and into the inside of the mound where the young initiate is, would be muffled and changed and perhaps become a bit more ethereal and maybe induce altered states of consciousness, or at the very least create a different experience than whatever it is they experienced in the previous 10, 15, 20 years of their life. As for the first question, the function of the isolated restricted ritual space being dissociated from the observation of biennial sky events, I actually don't think so. I think the skyscape needs to be it really is the missing ingredient to think about how and when these sites were used. Because for instance, in Portugal, these passage graves were ritually sealed when they were not being used and opened again. There's evidence of this happening several times, not in every single structure, but the best preserved ones have evidence that clearly there was a bit of packing of stones to hide where the entrance was, and then they were clearly opening it up, which suggests that they weren't doing this all the time. Then of course, they could still be doing this every month or every week, we don't know, but maybe because the alignments seem to be intentional, maybe they were doing this just for a couple of weeks in the year when the alignment was visible. And maybe the alignment was part of the experience. We spoke about the sound and the visuals and the art and etc. And maybe either the light of the sun coming in or whoever is inside looking out and seeing this star that they know is not yet visible outside, maybe that's part of the secret. Maybe that was the secret information that was passed on to them. Look, the star is already there, even though all the people who are not members of the secret society can't see it. So I think the two are actually closely associated. Now, because I've mentioned skyscapes may not play a role in every single megalithic grave, it's quite possible that in some other cases that wasn't happening. I do think it's a case of, across a wide landscape, different communities sharing a ritual language and an architectural language, but then implementing that in slightly different ways. And I would suggest the premium example of that, if you've seen any of the talks by Lionel Sims around Stonehenge or Avery, the fact that Stonehenge and Avery were being built in multiple phases, roughly at the same time, almost as if they were competing with each other. They want to, Stonehenge appears and puts stones on the original henge, and then Avery constructs a stone circle, and it's larger than the one at Stonehenge. And then Stonehenge adds the avenue, and then Avery adds 2 avenues. And it seems that they are trying to see which one can bring down their cosmology and their ideology down to earth in a more meaningful, monumental way. And that might have been happening with these smaller structures as well, across different communities. There was clearly a shared language, but the implementations would have varied. That's at least my thinking.
Have we got any more questions? I imagine we're all a bit stunned by some of this, Fabio, and people are relatively...
John Cox was in the chat.
Oh, where's
John?
John, go for it if you've been unmuted. Where's John Cox? Oh, there's John.
There he is.
Okay.
Good to see you, John.
Yeah.
Hi. There's a huge megalithic structure in the south of Spain. There's the one with the pillars, and there's a well in it. There's not much passageway. It's almost like a sort of vast hall. You'll know it, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Antiquarian.
Okay, so this is at the far end of the spectrum. This is a big internal space with not much passage. Can you take this into your overall theory, or how might you take it in?
Well, I'll put a parenthesis first, and then I'll give you the direct answer. Yeah. The parenthesis is that we need to be very careful about what the monuments look like today, particularly in Spain and Portugal, because once they've been excavated, they very, very rarely put them back to the way they were, especially the soil level. And I've noticed this in many, many cases in Portugal and Spain. And I've always had to go back to the excavation reports to find out what the original depth of the monument was and reconstruct it from there. Now, in that specific case, I actually don't know. I've never read the excavation report. I've been there, but I haven't read the excavation report. What I think is that that structure is actually of a completely different nature to the ones we've been talking about. Because the passage, for instance, is not differentiated from the chamber.
Right.
It's just one big rectangular hall, if you want, which has pillars inside.
Yeah.
And it has a very interesting orientation. But I think that whatever they were using it for was unique and different. And it needs to be looked at as a single case, much like you would look at Stonehenge or Avery, I suppose.
Okay. Yeah.
And I haven't even attempted to do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Fabio.
Good to see you.
Yes.
All right. I'm thinking we're getting towards the end of our time. Unless anyone's got an urgent question or comment to make. I'm not against a further comment or question, but my feeling is that, it's quite, for me at any rate, I'm maybe...
Abby had her hand up, didn't she?
Oh,
or was Abby is different? Is another question or not?
Oh, I don't know if it's just that there. Abiola.
It's just that. Abby?
I think that's hand hasn't gone down from last time. My feeling.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to say, I think, unless I'm interrupted.
Quick question.
Sorry.
Quick question.
Go on then.
You're right, Fabio. Do you know what the I'm asking about the pastoralism and horticulturalism. Do we know what is the state? What is the knowledge now? Which came first, horticulturalism or pastoralism? I'm not sure. I mean, this is in general, not just on the British Isles.
The short answer is they seem to appear roughly at the same time in archaeological terms in the Near East. They appear in different parts of the Near East, pastoralism in the mountains and farming in the lowlands, but roughly at the same time. And eventually they start spreading around and they merge into what we call the Neolithic. and then they spread through Europe and eventually reach the British Isles together. But yeah, they emerged at different times. But because when we look, I mean, we're talking about 10 to 12,000 years ago. The further back we look, the more difficult it is to tell the timing, the chronological timings of these things in a degree of resolution that we can actually separate them. And that's what happens there. So all the narratives, all the archaeological narratives you will see, they basically appear at the same time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, Fabio, you are an astonishingly, I don't know, accomplished lecturer. I thought the way in which you did that was so, and you warned us you were going to be reading a boring paper, and it wasn't like that at all. It didn't sound like you were at any point reading. It just sounded extraordinarily,
I like to,
I don't know, it was very clever, very brilliant. So
I like to set the bar low so I can overcome it.
Well, I would definitely say, as far as any future Zoom, if this COVID goes on another few years, you've got the job. That's what I would say. It's a very successful, evening. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Fabio, wonderful. So I'm going to say goodbye to everybody. We'll see you next week. Next week's going to be a panel discussion.
Say something about next week. Say something about next week.
I was just doing that, Camilla, but thanks for reminding me. Yes, next week, I'm sure all of you know that David Graeber very unexpectedly and tragically died on the 2nd of September, and we're all absolutely shocked and just bemused really by it all, but it's obviously raised a huge number of questions. And next week, we're going to have a panel discussion on the anthropology and you know, maybe the activism as well of David. We've tried to get a fairly wide panel, but for various reasons, most the people we asked for different, you know, on very understandable grounds, felt it a little bit too early to have a sort of academic debate and discussion of David's work. So it's going to be sort of a RAG UCL panel of myself, Camilla Power, and Jerome Lewis. David.
Yourself, Jerome Lewis, and Camilla, and some others will comment from the floor.
And
okay.
some others will be no doubt commenting from the floor.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's next week, and it should be a decent, interesting thing, and I'm looking forward to it. So thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.